Cheers. This is Ray Capote for the Misfits Mystique. So just to recap the last episode, the premiere episode in terms of long form video, and my goal from July 18th until now was to recap James Good's book right here, The Making of the Misfits. And in Mr. Good's book, he chronicled how the Misfits was filmed in and around Reno and then down in LA at Paramount Studios. So it goes back to when, you know, as a kid, I've always liked cars. Every young boy loves model cars and Mattel, Hot Wheels. Later on, I was able to acquire a Cadillac, a pink Cadillac convertible, and I'll show you that in another video. Found this at a antique store, and it was Clark Gable on the cover. And it turned out that his last movie was called The Misfits, and that was in 1960 when they filmed it, and they released it in 1961. So that caught my attention, and then also Marilyn Monroe was in it. Then I covered the book by Ralph Roberts, and that's the main book we're going to be covering in the next month or so. Roberts was the masseuse for Marilyn Monroe. He met her through Lee Strasberg at his apartment in the kitchen. He walked in there in 1955, and she happened to be there, and he asked Susan Strasberg, Lee's daughter, who is that? And she said to him, "You don't know her? That's Marilyn Monroe. Are you kidding me?" This was 1955, you know. She did a number of great movies. She just recently had done The 7-Year Itch. So Roberts looked and said, "Wow, she looks amazing." And then later on, we'll cover that in 1959, he ended up being her masseuse. So just to let you know, I think it's pretty obvious that, so what I'm wearing, for those who are familiar with the Misfits, this was the outfit that Clark Gable wore in the Misfits. It was released on February 1st, 1961, and this was Gay Langland's outfit, that the character that Clark Gable played. So he wore the cowboy hat, the tan shirt, the tan Levi's jacket. This is what I wear, is the Levi's. I couldn't find, I believe it was a Wrangler. I'll look into that. And then the tan pants. And then the movie was shot in black and white, so it's hard to be exact, but there were some color photographs, but it's very close to what Gable wore in the Misfits. Also, as you can see, so the Misfits was filmed between July 18th of 1960 to mid-November, I believe it was mid-October of 1960 as well, back at Paramount Studios. So I'm trying to capture that era. I already like the era of the mid-50s to the early 60s, and that's the cars that I like as well. It's the so-called Find era, which was from around 1957 to 64. So that's my favorite era as far as fashion, as far as automobiles. So I have the lamp that I got at a hospice store years ago, and I really like it. I got these recently, the table, the desk, the phone. So this basically represents in the TV set. It basically represents the mid-century modern, I don't know who comes up with these names, of the early 50s to the mid-60s. So as far as today, if you saw my short, today we're discussing the origins of the Misfits. So Arthur Miller met Marilyn Monroe in New York City. You know, he's from New York. He wrote famously many Broadway plays, including the famous Death of a Salesman. Meets Marilyn Monroe. Instantly is charmed by her, as everyone else is. He really thought that she was a great actress, but was not getting the roles or the script that she deserved. In March of 1956, he flies out to Reno, Nevada, because Reno had very lenient divorce laws. So we're talking about 1956. The United States did not have no-fault divorce at that time. But Reno was very lenient. You didn't really have to prove a lot to get a divorce. So he flew out there to Reno, and he stayed near a place called Pyramid Lake. So I actually visited that last summer in 2025. So it's 2026 obviously now, January. And then this lady moves in right next to Arthur Miller. Her name was Peggy Marsh. She was 65 years old, and obviously Nevada was this hotbed at that time for people who wanted to get divorces. And he befriended her. They became good buddies. And Peggy would drive him into Reno because Arthur Miller did not have a car. He just flew out there. There was a mandatory thing where they had to stay in residence for 6 weeks. That's why he was there at this shack. Why he was at this shack and not in Reno proper, I do not know. But they became friends. She would drive him into town to do his laundry. And one day she says, I got a friend, Mrs. Sticks, and she lives about 20 miles here from the lake. Would you like to come with me? And he said, sure, I'll go with you. And this was about 20 miles southwest of Pyramid Lake. And I went there as well. It was not too hot. It was last summer. And this was in, late July. Like I said, July 18th is when I went out there. And it's this draw, and there's a hill next to it. That's where they filmed a lot of the shots of the Misfits. So if you saw the Misfits, Clark Gable and Marilyn Monroe, they meet at Harrah's Casino in Reno. And Gay Langland says to Roslyn, hey, or Roslyn says, I'll rent a car and we'll go out to see the country. And that was Quail Canyon at the Sticks Ranch. So Miss Marsh rented that house to a lady from back east. And Arthur Miller went out there with her because apparently she had some pots and pans. Mrs. Sticks had some pots and pans that she kept from Miss Marsh. She gave her some pots and pans that she needed. So those were great times where people, you need a cup of sugar, here's a cup of sugar. You need some pots and pans. You drive 20 miles to give this person some pots and pans. So she said to Arthur Miller, Peggy Marsh said, you know, do you want to come out there with me? And he said, hell yeah. Pardon the French. Hell, heck yeah, let me go out there. I'm just really bored in this shack. So as a change of scenery, Arthur Miller said, you know, I'll go out there with you, Peggy. And so when they got out there to the Styx Ranch, there was a lady there, we don't know her name, who was renting that house. It was being constructed. And there was a couple cowboys and then this lady who was out in Reno to get a divorce. And Miller was there talking with them. There was an older cowboy, a younger cowboy, and another guy who was a cowboy, but he was very silent. It's funny, in James Good's book, he mentioned that there was a third guy. I thought it was pretty funny that every time he wanted to speak, he was going to say something, and then he never got a chance to say anything. So it was just 3 cowboys. But what caught Arthur Miller's attention was the things that they were talking about. And the older cowboy was saying, you know, before the war, what I would do to make some money was I would go into the mountains on horseback. And what he would do was he would go into the hills of Nevada and drive these horses down, and he would capture them and sell them as ponies to little kids so they can ride them. Fast forward to this time, we're talking about March of 1956. And at this time when Miller got to the Styx Ranch, he was talking to these guys and he was really fascinated. The younger cowboy said, well, what we do now is that we go out into the mountains and we drive them out. So Miller asked him, can I come out with you? And the guy said, yeah. So they went out and Miller observed how they did this. So the younger cowboy, who was living at a ranch nearby, both of these guys just had marginal jobs. They'd moved from town to town throughout the U.S., finding a job here and there. They were womanizers, they were macho guys and living the wild life and just not conforming to, you know, everyday life. And so Miller goes out there, and the younger cowboy, he knew how to fly a plane. It was called a Piper Cub. And he would fly to the outskirts and see. By this time, there was not too many horses because these wranglers, after the war, just wiped them out. And there'd be a few, 15 here, 20 here. Just not too many of these Mustangs left, these wild Mustangs. And so Miller goes out there, and the young cowboy gets in his plane and he flies over the mountains, and you will see that in the movie, and he drives them out. Flies really low, scares the horses, these wild Mustangs, and they come through the pass onto this dry lake. And then the older cowboy would be down there on a flatbed, and they would round them up and pick them up and sell them. So Miller, obviously, as a writer, a very accomplished writer, saw the makings of a story in possibly a movie later on. So he was there in March in Reno in 1956, goes back to New York, and on June 29th, 1956, he marries Marilyn Monroe in New York City. Marilyn had a contract to film The Prince and the Showgirl with Laurence Olivier in England. So in Egham, England, they fly out, and between July, this is Miller and his new wife, Marilyn Monroe, they fly out to Egham, England. And this was, I don't know, about 50 miles outside of London. But he starts writing. So as he's writing this, it becomes the short story. It's very similar to the screenplay that he writes for the Misfits. But the character Roslyn, Marilyn Monroe's character, is not that well defined yet. It was mainly the Cowboys driving out of the horses and so forth. And he was amazed, wow, I know more about this that I thought I did. So the problem when they got back to the States is that Miller tries to sell this story to the magazines, because the way it worked back then, you sell a short story, goes in the magazines. If it works out, then you can go into writing a screenplay or possibly a movie. In the case of Arthur Miller, he had a lot of trouble finding a magazine to publish his work. Finally, on October 1st of 1957, he found Esquire magazine, and they did publish it. Right around that time, a little bit earlier, Marilyn Monroe enters the doctor's hospital in New York City. She had an ectopic, I hope I pronounced that right, an ectopic pregnancy. Very serious. She had abdominal pains, and she went into the hospital early August of 1957, and they had surgery, and I don't know what that entailed. And on August 10th, we have pictures of the media of her leaving the hospital, and it was a miscarriage. So there was a lot going on at that time. In July of 1958, his publisher, Taylor, came to his house. So he lived in Greenwich, Connecticut, and Taylor lived in Roxbury, Connecticut. And they met up. Taylor called him up and said, his name was Frank Taylor, and they were good friends, and he called Arthur Miller up and he said, can I come over with my 4 boys? So he goes over to Roxbury, and they meet, and Miller says, sure, come over, but Marilyn's in the back room. She's like on this cleaning binge. Can you believe it? Marilyn Monroe is on a cleaning binge, and she has a vacuum, and if you don't mind that, you can come over. Yeah, if it was me, no problem. I'm coming over. I don't care if there's a jet plane 20 feet over the house. I'm coming over to see Marilyn Monroe. So Frank Taylor, his original publisher, comes over, and he brings his 4 kids, and Miller is talking. They're really good friends, and Miller says, I had a really good idea for a screenplay. And Miller said, it's called The Misfits, and he just went into character, and he played all the characters. And Taylor's kids were just fascinated, and they were very disappointed because Marilyn never came out. But they were impressed, the kids and Taylor, by the story that Miller was weaving. Taylor asked him, have you talked to anyone? Have you told anybody? And Miller said, no. You're the first person I told about this story. And Taylor said, well, can you give me the screenplay? And Miller handed it to him, and Taylor took it and read it, and he called Miller back from Greenwich, and he said to Arthur Miller, Arthur, this is the greatest story and screenplay I have ever read. And Miller was reinforced, and they got together, and Taylor said, you know, the only person to play the older cowboy is Clark Gable. And also Frank Taylor said to Arthur Miller that John Huston is the only person that can direct this movie. So they called John Huston in Ireland because he lives there 4 months a year. And it turns out he didn't pick up, but they sent the screenplay to him, and then he was in Paris filming a movie. So it was forwarded to John Huston in Paris. He wires back to Miller and Taylor, I love it. I love this screenplay. So they realized that Clark Gable was the perfect actor for this. And they tried to reach him. He was in Paris filming Somewhere in Naples with Sophia Loren. And Gable calls back, or he wires in. Incredible story. Loved it. So they had their director in John Huston, they had their leading actor in Clark Gable. Obviously, they decided that the leading actress would be Marilyn Monroe, Arthur Miller's wife, for the role of Roslyn Tabor. So, as you can see, it started with Miller going to Reno. Fell in love with Marilyn Monroe. Saw these cowboys. And if you realize, Peggy Marsh, that would be Thelma Ritter's character. Then because she was older, 65 years old, the divorcee would be the role of Marilyn Monroe, who was renting the Sticks house. Clark Gable is the older cowboy, and they added the character of Guido. They added Guido as a mechanic, as Gay Langland's friend. So Miller wrote this story as a Valentine's gift to Marilyn Monroe, as a love story, because he felt she never had the right role. She was a great actress, and she just never got the opportunity to show what a good actress she was in a serious role. She really wanted that, and Miller gave her that in the form of the Misfits. So I hope you enjoyed this episode showing the origins of the Misfits. And my name is Ray Capote for the Misfits Mystique. Good night.